Good afternoon, classmates. I hope everyone's healthy. This is my presentation on chapter 23 of our text, Ethnographies of Policing. The chapter starts off with the definition of ethnography as the book would like to give it to us, which is a close-up study of culture and how meaning is produced. It then goes into what is going to be talked about within this chapter and how it's going to focus on the tactics used in field work when studying police organization, behaviors, tactics, and just generally when studying the police. It then goes into a little bit of the history of ethnographies in policing, and it talks about William Wesley in his late 1940s into the early 1950s. He did an ethnography in Gary, Indiana, where he studied police and violence and published a paper on that in 1953, and he studied police and secrecy, and he published a paper on that in 1955. But it wasn't until the 1960s when public interest in policing grew exponentially that the MIT Press published his paper, Violence and the Police, in 1970 due to that rise in public interest in the police. It then moves on to the first section of our text, of this chapter, and it goes into policing itself. So it talks about how research on policing is all centered around the Peel model, and the Peel model is basically, it refers to like the public and visible side of policing. So it's like the preventative measures, the responsiveness of police, how seeing uniformed police is relaxing to the population, and how it expects police to be politically neutral in how they operate their jobs, because there needs to be unbiased policing and unbiased when dealing with populations. So there are differences in the cultural and social biases when it refers to police legitimacy. So there are three major factors that produce bias when talking about police legitimacy, and that's religious beliefs, common law, and the legal systems of that area. So all three will play a role into how the public's perception of police is played. Religion, because that's going to affect your compassion and whatnot, and affect how you view society as a whole. Common law, because that expects your idea of what is typically expected of you through the law. And then the legal system itself is how like the police will enact these common law principles, as well as the statutory law in the United States. Moving forward, it talks about, in the same section, it talks about semi-formal and part-time policing. So this is like police reserves, auxiliaries, military policing, and private policing. And it talks about how these really haven't been researched that heavily because there's just not a lot on there. People focus mainly on the public side of policing, and they don't really focus on these smaller, less known groups because it's not really where the big ticket funding goes to. And then it moves into the second section, besides the introduction, of this chapter, which is Contingency Mandates, Strategy, Tactics, Theme, and Focus. And so it talks about how that all occupations have a form of a mandate. And this mandate, I'll get to the definition in a second. I'm going to define uncertainties first, because uncertainties play into the definition of a mandate. So we'll get back to mandate in a second. But just so you know, all occupations have some form of a mandate. Uncertainties are things that groups are tasked with trying to control. So it's all like these, and these are like sin, disease, poverty, ignorance, crime, and deviance. Those are some of the key sort of uncertainties that are faced with organizations. So institutions assemble and to deal with these uncertainties. So institutions as a whole, organizations, occupations, they're all about dealing with uncertainties. Every job out there, every institution, they're all centered around these uncertainties and how to handle and deal with them. And the rules that these institutions put into place to deal with these uncertainties are the mandates. So that's how it ties back to the original part, is these uncertainties lead these organizations to form and to establish rules to deal with these uncertainties, and these rules that are established to deal with the uncertainties are the mandates that are in place. So the number one uncertainty that police face is negative unwanted risk. So that's just, they can't predict it. It's coming, and it's when the risk is negative, and it's just and people like and it's unwanted in the neighborhood, and it's having a negative impact on the neighborhood or community or wherever. And that's the number one uncertainty, is the police just don't know when that's going to happen, and they have to deal with it when it does arrive. So a major claim of the police is to supply security and political ordering in the face of uncertainty. So the police are kind of trying to be the organization that's like, yeah, we live in an uncertain world, and it could be dangerous, and it could be politically divisive and politically explosive, but we are going to be that centerpiece, that neutral, politically neutral like order that will protect. So that kind of relies on police. So police rely on that trust that the public has for them in order to actively pursue their role of being these enforcers of chaos. I mean, not enforcers of chaos, of like controllers of chaos. They prevent chaos from exploding. So police rely on these trust between us and the public, between them and the public. A theme is how like they tell the public about their work, and a major part of that is responsiveness. So let's say like if you call the police and they show up in 2 minutes and they deal with your problem, like boom, 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 and get out of there, you're gonna have a good perception of the police. But let's say you call the police for an issue, they take forever to get there, and they take forever to process the information, you're gonna have a negative view of the police. So a major thing for when it comes to police trust with people is their responsiveness and how fast they can deal with problems. So to deal with, to promote their responsiveness, these are some of the strategies the police use to show themselves in the community and have like themselves spread out so they can respond to different issues as efficiently as possible. And that is random patrols, responding to calls for service, and investigating crimes. So the random patrols, they're going to spot crime or be close enough that they can respond to it when need be. Responding to calls is so they can, like I said, efficiently get there and deal with the situation. And then investigating crimes, because if there's like a spree of crimes that are going on and it's not been solved, people are going to have distrust in the police and they're going to be scared. But if the police are solving crimes, they can't solve them before they happen, but as about as quickly as they can after they happen, the public's going to have a positive view of the police. Police research in the United States since the 1960s. The government agencies and foundations have started to provide funding for research groups in the 1980s to look at police tactics and practices. And this was to evaluate them, make sure that they were up to date and not having negative impacts on the community. This is, if you don't know much history about the 1980s, there was a lot of police violence in that time leading up to this. So there was a heavy interest in policing and how our tactics should be better used. So the next section is on fieldwork and ethnography. And so fieldwork explains behavior in a given setting. So that's kind of like you're put into a situation and your job is to just record, and it is observing and experiencing the setting or a group or an organization. It's your job to just be in that area or wherever you are and write down and observe, and you are the data collection. You are collecting everything you see, hear, smell, touch, feel. That is data. That is data that you are going to use in your ethnography. So ethnography has a literary aspect as well. So this is like the underlying thing is, once you've seen and processed all this information, how do you put it into paper? How do you explain it so that people will understand what you're trying to convey to them and that will take a positive message away from it? They give a little history about ethnography and how it started in the mid-1800s in London, and how it started in the U.S. with the Polish Peasant Project by Thomas Zanicki in 1918 at the University of Chicago. So it shows that it had started in the mid-1800s in England, and then it finally made its way over to the United States in the early 1900s. A lot of those early ethnographies focused only on crime. They didn't really focus on the actual policing methods. So they went in and they looked at the deviance and whatnot, but they didn't look at how the police were dealing with this deviance. So the rationale for fieldwork and how it facilitates the readings of cultures is all about document gathering, like analysis, observation, interviewing, and recording events. So this is like, when you're doing your ethnography, you need to be always looking for more information. The more information you can gather from the primary source while you're in there, the more information you're going to be able to talk about in your paper and a better understanding of that culture and the subculture that you are immersed in. So ethnography is writing about culture. That's part of writing what writing an ethnography is. It's about the culture. It's also the style of field research, which is observed, and how to write about that. It is a form of communication between the observer and the observed, and the reader and the writer. So it's kind of like you are giving out the message. As an ethnographer, you are observing, and then you are telling the message of the observed to the reader. You are the middleman in that interaction, in that distribution of knowledge. So there are some issues within field research. Interference, proof-based, on field data. So I'm going to read from my notes here so I can make sure I'm giving you all of the issues with field research. Interference, proof based on field data, validity of field data, degree to which it is reliable and cumulative, and the relationship between the researcher and their data. It's complicated as well, but the personality of a researcher is also can be a tool, and it can be a negative effect. So that if a researcher's personality is one that is very explanative and explains everything to the people, that's going to be a good personality trait, and then you have some negative personality traits in the shine through. And a quote that I pulled, it is from Punch in 1989, and it's ethnographic work is punctuated by difficulties, moral quandaries, and dilemmas. So I found that interesting because it kind of talks about how it's not the easiest. You're going to deal with a lot of stuff. You're going to deal with a lot of like dilemmas and moral quandaries, and that's just part of the work. It's going to be a part of the work for a long time. And then it goes into culture, and it's making sense about what the researcher sees. So, like records, like I was saying, records smell what they hear, what they touch. So there are variations within culturally defined groups, which are called subcultures or segments. The rest of the reading, when it talks about the police force, uses segments, so we'll stick to segments. And so the fieldwork begins with a series of questions or hunches. And if you don't know what that question or hunch is, you're going to have a hard time with your ethnographic fieldwork, which is why young fieldworkers usually have problems when it comes to taking their research and trying to answer the questions which they need to figure out themselves of what their data is trying to answer. So subcultures, going back on that for a second, are actually they're derived based on the uncertainties that that group faces. So that's why you have so many different subcultures, especially within policing. You get like the different segments and subcultures because they're all faced with different uncertainties. Some groups might have to deal with X, Y, and Z, while other groups have to deal with A, B, and C. So they're going to be tailored to what they're dealing with in their communities. All right, the next section is occupational organizational ethnographic studies. So this is looking at types of ethnographies and their features. So it talks about how many ethnographies there were throughout the years. It talks about how it talks about specific subcultures and like occupational tension within those subcultures and occupational tension within the police force. It talks about, so these are the occupational focused ethnographies. There were 6 in 1960, 10 in 1970, 11 in 1980, 16 in 1990, and 16 and 20 in the 2000s. And then in organizational focused ethnographies, there was 3 in the 1970s, 7 in the 1980s, 15 in the 1990s, and 15 in the 2000s. So organizational research really took off around the turn of the century. And it needed, but there is a need to study private policing and the impact of technologies, crime mapping, and CompStat, because there's not a whole lot on that information currently. So over time, these models have shown that we're moving on from the Peel model that was originally talked about in the history section, and it's starting to look more to many forms of policing and kind of looking at policing as a holistic area, not just a black and white, like cookie cutter sort of method. We then go to field work with the police, um, and ethnographic work with the police, which brings together like the secretive, violent, complex, and traditional um, like organizational ways of police and the context that the research team or the researcher is going to be looking through that with. Um, so one sees the problems like faced in the police force when they're doing an ethnography of the police, and they are like, and you're able to define and react and manage that as you observe it. Um, and it also shows the way like police handle and situations and the tactics that they use in those situations shows their personalities, and that allows like, so an example used in the book was like Skid Row and like the homeless population, and how like instead of dealing with them in a negative connotation, police use different tactics to deal with them in a better connotation, which showed that they had a compassionate personality, and they felt bad for these people, and instead of like persecuting them and like charging them and whatnot, they took a more lenient way. It also talked about organizational like differences and problems, and it talks about how like patrol officers might look at the police force as like a punitive bureaucracy, how sergeants look at the police organization as and their role in it as like mediators to sustain their power and authority, like they need to be the mediator between like the top command and like the regular officers, or else they're not going to be able to have their jobs for much longer. And then it talks about how top command and how like they use the rules and the tools to keep the troops in order. So like they're trying to just keep everyone in line. They're not trying to have it just go to fall apart at the seams. This is probably the longest section in the chapter. It talks about the actions of officers like produce both positive and negative consequences and outcomes, and you need to observe the fallout in your ethnography of these outcomes in order to see how the situation unfolds and see why the situation unfolds a certain way, to get a clear understanding of what's happening within that organization and culture. So police like to maintain a definitive border between what is public and what is private. They like to keep their private lives and their public lives separate, and they also like to keep to themselves, and they like to immerse themselves in that culture of like family and brotherhood and whatnot. So field workers need to establish some kind of trust or like quasi-trust with them in order to actually get to see the truth behind the mask sort of thing. And an example the book used was Jennifer Hunt was able to uncover lies that officers had told in court to cover things up. So she was able to go in there and get their trust, and then she was able to see that there was corruption and that police officers were lying to get things through court and cover and helping each other out because of that system of brotherhood and family. So it talks about how research needs to be done to look at the internal dynamics of the police across their segments. So it talks about how like early studies are very like sociological, and that there's not a whole lot on the occupational culture of the police, and that central interests relate to like those their roles in their division of labor. So there's 5 segments of the police organization, and that is police officers, supervisors, top command, specialized unit, and investigators. And each dynamic has a character and a specified role, which is going to lead them to have their own views on the police force and on their roles within the police force. And they need to look at those, and researchers need to look at those connections holistically from a moral, political, economic, and social factors. And then there's also, within those segments, there's social identity, which plays a role, and that's gender, age, rank, ethnicity, and religion. So segments want to maintain their relationship with the public, and they want to maintain their webs of exchange. So they want to be able to stay in the public's good side so they can continue to progress themselves. And on the topic of progressing themselves, the segments also have to hold the order of power of the police force in high respect, or else they're not going to have career advancement, sponsorship of proteges, like rank, promotion, pay and protection, and that protection comes in the form of punishments and investigation. So if they hold a high rule for the law in the organization of the police force, they're going to be less likely to be investigated by internal affairs or be demoted or prosecuted. Moving on to the last section of this chapter, besides the conclusion, the fading of ethnography, and this basically is a short little section about how ethnographies in sociology are fading, but they're still prevalent in anthropology. But this is all focused on sociology, and the reasons for it fading within sociology are that the first reason is PhD programs are focused on statistics and data analysis, so they're not really asking their PhD candidates to go out into the field and do long, tedious ethnographies anymore. They want them to be quick and look at and just purely based on data analysis. Fewer professors can teach qualitative methods. That's becoming an issue because, as it was noted, fewer PhD students are doing ethnographies and using qualitative methods. They're using more quantitative methods and focused on these qualitative methods. They're focused on these quantitative methods, so they can't really teach the next generation about these qualitative methods because they themselves have not learned these qualitative methods. Young students are trying to finish their degrees faster, so they don't want to sit in the field and do a year-long study on a police force in Gary, Indiana. They want to go and they want to get their degree and they want to go get their job. Because college, as we know, is growing in costs, so students are trying to get out of college faster. Young faculty are less focused on individual research. They're more focused on collective research, and they're not actually they're not in there to just publish novels and get out of the college. The field is also dominated by statistics. So sociology is now becoming a more statistics-driven field, and it's making more generalizations. Fieldwork is a younger person's craft. So as I was saying, the younger people are the people that are not the ones participating in the ethnographies, but it is tailored towards the younger generations because it's tedious, it's time-consuming, it takes a lot of energy, you need to be dedicated and committed, and it's just a horrible, horrible slow decay of ethnographies because these young people are the ones that need to be doing it, but the young people are the ones that don't even know how to do it. And many major projects require long and detailed field notes. And that's just hard to get. A lot of these studies they try to finish it as quick as possible, so these long and detailed field notes that are needed for an ethnography are not really found anymore. That's all I have on this chapter. I'm going to post some discussion questions to that forum, so stay tuned on that. And I hope everyone's staying safe and staying healthy. Remember to wash your hands. Have a good day. Hope to see you guys before the end of the semester. If not, I'll see you guys next semester.